Chapter 27. Welcome to Israel. Israel, 1990. A hysterical passenger in his early 70s, his expensive tailored suit spattered with blood, was being taken off when Ari boarded the plane. He had finally convinced a flight attendant that his wife had been killed in the attack. Though overcome with shock and his own grief, Ari, after long years of training and practice, instinctively absorbed and evaluated every part of his surroundings and the swiftly moving events. He marveled at the speed and skill with which the superbly trained and prepared El Al crew controlled what would otherwise have been utter chaos on the plane, speaking with absolute authority and assurance as they went up and down the aisle seeing to special needs. The flight attendants brought a sense of calm and safety to the passengers, many of whom were in a state of near collapse when they came aboard. The Orly control tower gave the ill-fated flight priority, clearing all other planes, both arriving and departing, out of its path. Ari had hardly settled in his assigned window seat when the plane rumbled down the runway, climbed aloft, and headed for Israel. 4 dead and 7 severely wounded passengers had been left behind. As soon as the plane was safely in the air, the captain's voice came over the intercom to share some confidential information in explanation of the quick departure in the wake of such unspeakable tragedy. Just before the attack, the French police received an anonymous tip that it would happen, declared the captain in a firm but sympathetic voice. The informant said there would be 2 groups of terrorists, 4 each. We could take no chances, had to get the plane aloft. We're now safely en route to Israel. Although Israel is constantly targeted by terrorists, you'll be safer there than almost anywhere else in the world. An attack like this could not happen at Tel Aviv's Lod airport, where you will be landing. We'll keep you advised of our progress. Sunk deep in his seat, Ari tried to distract himself by idly watching the changing panorama of fading French countryside playing out far below. He was in an agony of despair. Into the dark pit of his soul were compacted, in sledgehammer blows of memory, every endearing moment of the brief but sweet life he and Nikki had shared as lovers. As the joyous and beautiful facets of their 6 years together passed in pain-ridden review, he gave in to consuming guilt. The tragic ending was all his fault. He'd been proud and stubborn. She had been so loyal, so true, so ready to be everything he needed. Of course, he had planned to marry her when the time was right, but that time just hadn't come. Why? Why? If only he had made the commitment years ago that she had so ardently desired, that would have been more honorable and might have changed everything. Maybe they would have let him stay, since Nikki was a native of France, or at least that might have changed the time factor. He probably wouldn't have been scheduled for this ill-fated flight, and Nicole would still be alive. It was impossible to believe that Nikki was gone, and that the passionate purpose to which his life had been devoted for the past 25 years had died as well, and he was now going into exile. If only this or that had or had not happened, or he'd had a different attitude, or made a wiser choice here or there. The turmoil of regret and self-accusation was endless. And Abdul, could his gun have killed her? How could he have ended like this? Scenes from the past followed quickly on the heels of one another in anguished procession, and always that indelible vision of Nikki's lifeless form in a pool of blood returned with searing clarity. And her last words, there was something arresting and haunting about them. "I'll be in Jerusalem before you." His initial revulsion at the spiritual implications was now replaced by a burning need to know what that dream had meant. Her Messiah madness had been a central part of the story, so there was an underlying religious meaning. That would have been more than enough cause for him to dismiss the whole thing. But her vivid dream had been so unusual, so gripping. He wrestled with the strangely compelling words, "I'll be in Jerusalem before you." He tried to tell himself that it meant nothing, yet at the same time he felt irresistibly drawn by the thought that there was some mysterious meaning behind it all. Nicole had become a fanatical Christian, which made everything she said suspect. Yet the conviction in her voice had not been fanaticism, but something very different, something that had captivated him in spite of his skepticism. He owed it to himself, but especially to her memory now, to fathom that mystery. To Ari, the cult of the crucified Jew was a demeaning religion. What little he knew repelled and offended him. Yet those words, "I'll be in Jerusalem," had a strange power that he couldn't explain. Somewhere he'd heard that Christians associated Jerusalem with heaven. Had Nikki had a premonition of her death? Was that possible? Could all such connections between intuition and subsequent events in the exterior world be explained as mere coincidence? Could something more be involved? Carl Jung, among many others, had seen a relationship. The idea was becoming more acceptable even among physicists. But what could be the connection between the material universe and that non-physical dimension that Nicole had believed in as a medical scientist even before she had become a Christian? He had to know. Once the plane had reached its cruising altitude, Ari jumped out of his seat and hurried to a restroom. There he washed Nikki's blood from his hands and face and out of his hair, and tried to get the worst of it off his shirt and pants. As he scrubbed and dabbed and wiped himself dry, and watched Nikki's blood go down the drain, Ari was reminded that the red stain that had covered him had saved his life. Had Nikki not been in the path of the bullets that killed her, he would have died. He wished it could have been the other way. She had abundant reason to live. He no longer had any. Tiny Israel would be his prison. And little Ari Paul, what would become of him? Returning to his seat, Ari had to slip past a doctor and 2 nurses who were moving down the aisle, taking blood pressures, calming fears, giving tranquilizers, finding only a few superficial cuts and bruises to deal with, but much lingering hysteria. An identical team was working its way down the opposite aisle, ministering to the needs of the passengers in the same way. The most popular remedy, however, was the wine and hard liquor that was being passed out liberally and without charge as token compensation from El Al for the trauma everyone had suffered. Midway through the flight, overwhelmed by the enormity of his tragedy and his inability to cope with the complexities involved, Ari drifted into a troubled slumber. Completely exhausted by the events and stress of the previous 48 hours, it was only when the intercom crackled loudly over his head and the pilot announced their final approach into Tel Aviv that he at last came out of a profound sleep. When the plane penetrated beneath the low cloud cover just before it touched down, Ari caught his first glimpse of his new homeland. So this was Israel. A feeling of revulsion was his only reaction as he took in Tel Aviv's drab, low airport and the desert-like landscape surrounding it. The plane had no sooner rolled to a stop near the terminal than it was boarded by a dozen or more men and women, none of them uniformed, who said little but watched every move the passengers made. One of their number, apparently in charge, spoke over the intercom briefly. "Welcome to Israel, ladies and gentlemen. We profoundly regret what happened in Paris, but since it did occur, we must deal with that fact. You will all be taken to a debriefing room. That phase shouldn't take long. Your baggage will be held for you. Now, please follow me." Coming off the plane, Ari fell in line with the other passengers, making their way as directed toward the terminal under the watchful eyes of young soldiers armed with Uzis. Ari immediately noticed and tabbed as a Mossad agent a muscular man in jeans and flowered shirt open at the neck, who was standing to one side and scrutinizing each passenger. His eye caught Ari's. "You, Thalberg!" he yelled and motioned for Ari to fall out of line and follow him. "Welcome to Eretz Israel," he said tersely when Ari had joined him. "My name's Ariel," he added, reaching out to give Ari a warm handshake. "Sorry about Orly. Now you know just a little bit what it's like to be a Jew." He set off at a fast pace and motioned for Ari to follow. "You get to have your own private debriefing," he explained. Inside, the terminal was awash with immigrants, principally from the Soviet Union. Bewilderment, ecstatic joy, stoicism, and a dozen other emotions were written on the faces of these homecomers to the promised land of their forefathers. Here was the sanctuary of the chosen. At least that was the hope in their hearts, the faith that they would find a place of refuge at last. As his escort pushed his way through the churning mass of humanity pressed into the small terminal, The alien sounds of Hebrew and the electric excitement of the new arrivals left Ari feeling all alone in spite of the jostling crowds that surrounded him. There was no way that his deportation to this uninviting and isolated land could bring him any joy. He would never have chosen to come here. For him, this was a place not of promise but of exile. How long would it be his prison? Would he ever be able to leave? To gain entrance, he had been forced to admit his Jewishness to the world, a heritage that was still a source of shame to him. What irony that he, who had hated Jews and especially Zionists, should have been forced to throw in his lot with these despised people. Ari was well aware that anti-Semitism was on the rise everywhere. At the same time that the Berlin Wall was coming down, bringing new freedom and democracy to millions, neo-Nazism had been on the rise, and Jewish cemeteries throughout Europe were being defaced with swastikas. He had seen some of them. On his last trip to Warsaw, he'd also seen the venomous epithet resurrected from the past, "Jews to the ovens," newly spray-painted on the Jewish State Theater. How could he take his place as one of these persecuted people? Better that he had died at Orly and Nicole had lived. To make matters worse, he was now consigned to live among them in Zion. The very claim that this minuscule land was some foreordained sanctuary of the chosen was repugnant to him. Chosen people, indeed. By whom and for what? In actuality, they were an abominated race surrounded by 200 million Arabs who were sworn to their, and now his, extermination. Ari absorbed every detail of the people and events around him, even as he was hustled through the airport. He noted and marveled at the rapidity with which the continual influx of Jewish immigrants arriving from the Soviet Union and elsewhere was organized into small groups and funneled outside to several desks where they were processed and taken off to temporary accommodations. At Orly Airport, on the plane, and now here, he had already seen enough to admit begrudgingly that Israeli efficiency was worthy of his admiration. After they had passed through the terminal, Ari's guide led him down a short, narrow hallway, where he stopped at the open door of a small, sparsely furnished office. A depressing greenish-yellow hue reflected from the dingy walls and ceiling. The lone occupant was a bright-looking young man of about 30 years of age. He looked up from the papers he was working on and stared at Ari coldly, his face an expressionless mask. "Here's your man," said Ariel. With a perfunctory good luck to Ari, he disappeared back down the hallway. "Come in and sit down," said the young man, motioning the new immigrant toward a shoddy, straight-backed chair, one of 3 lined up just in front of his desk. He scrutinized Ari closely as he seated himself, then continued to look him over in silence as though he were some specimen in a jar. Was it a test of wills? "If he thinks I'm going to say the first word, he'll wait a long time," thought Ari, deciding that he was going to dislike Israel even more than he'd imagined. "Well, you got quite a send-off at Orly," the young man said at last, matter-of-factly, without the slightest tinge of sympathy in his voice. "Are you suggesting it was aimed at me?" Ari was determined to match his inquisitor's aloofness. "No, a random strike as far as we know. PLO. You were aware of that?" "I presumed so. Then the pilot confirmed it about an hour out of Paris." "And you knew the one who survived? Abdullah Mustaf?" Ari raised his eyebrows in surprise. "How did you know that?" "That was obvious from both your reactions." "I suppose that astute observation is already in my file," commented Ari dryly. "Yes, I did know Abdul. I have nothing to hide. I sponsored him for his Ph.D. He was a good person, until he got mixed up with some Islamic radicals." With a slight nod, the young man continued. "He certainly knew Nicole, the girl you lived with for 6 years. Are you trying to impress me? I hope you haven't believed everything Interpol has to say about me. I was set up. We do our own work and verify everything passed on from outside sources. We've kept a growing dossier on you for the last 20 years. It takes up an entire file cabinet." "Then I guess you don't need to ask me any questions," declared Ari sarcastically. "You must already know everything that's worth knowing, maybe more than I know." A thin smile momentarily unfroze the young man's mouth, then gave up the effort. Perhaps. By the way, you can call me Uzi. Woodenly, Ari took the outstretched hand, which gripped his firmly. Uzi? The name of their famous submachine gun? Was that his real name, or was he being funny? Uzi reached out and turned on a small tape recorder that was sitting on top of a stack of papers on his desk. When was your last contact with Abdul? About 6 weeks ago. Where? On a platform in the Paris metro. Which one? L'Étoile. That's an unusual place to meet. It was Abdul's choice. We were lucky to get him to meet at all, but we failed in our mission. And what was that? Nicole, well, she and Abdi have been like brother and sister. I had Abdi as a student before I met Nikki. In fact, he introduced us. Ari turned away momentarily to get control of his voice, then continued.